Hello everyone, thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Soledad de Lemus from the University of Granada. Just to give you a little bit of background on Sole, she did her undergraduate and master's degree at the University of Granada and also her PhD, which she finished in 2008. She then moved to the University of Cardiff in 2008, and this is where we met, so we were both postdocs there at the same time. And this was followed by a brief period at the University of Malaga, and then she took up her current position at the University of Granada as an associate professor in social psychology. Sole does really very many interesting things. She's interested in how people deal with threats and disadvantage, in particular in an intergroup context. She's very interested in resistance to threats and disadvantage and inequality. She's worked on things like how people deal with the economic crisis in Spain, and she's particularly well known for her work on gender, which she's going to talk about today. So how do women deal with sexism, when and how do they resist sexism? And she's won an award for developing a very useful scale on measuring ambivalent sexism. That was a applied psychology award in Spain. And what I particularly like about her work is that she uses very interesting measures and very creative measures to get at resistance. So she has a line of work measuring resistance at the implicit level. She also works a lot with nonverbal behavior, and I think we'll get to hear about this today. So over to you.
Thanks. So thank you very much for inviting me, especially Nicole and the whole department. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I did a general term or title for the talk I'm going to give today. I called it Head and Tails of Smiling in Intergender Relationships, Effects of Sexism and its Confrontation. But basically I'm going to present two strands of research within this, so you'll now understand why I gave this term, hopefully. Whoops. Okay, so the background theoretical knowledge in the field or in the area that I'm going to present this stuff is the seminar work by Mary Jackman on the Velvet Glove, in which she argues that forms of prejudice and discrimination that are subtle make them more difficult to recognize and resist. So this has been clearly proved in the area of gender relations, specifically with benevolent sexism, which is a form of sexism, for those of you that are not familiar with it, that goes coated with a kind of palatable sugar type of flavor, because it's sexist, but it's nice. So most people, even women, would think it's not sexism and would demand it and would like it. And also paternalistic behavior. So there is a lot of empirical evidence showing how such constructs like benevolent sexism or paternalism influence women's decisions and performance. For instance, in some of the work we've done in our lab in Granada, we show that when in real partners, right, in real couples, so when the man gives a benevolent justification for restricting the woman's liberties or freedoms to choose to participate in an internship, and he does so he says, I think you shouldn't do it, he does so for benevolent reasons, then she would feel actually very positive emotions, and she would decide not to take the internship, even if the internship is good for her career. And also there is evidence showing that benevolent sexism makes women seek dependence rather than autonomy. So such ambivalent or evaluative mixed forms of discrimination are not always recognized as such. That's the problem. And they are difficult to confront, mainly because they have very high social costs. So if you confront something that it's not clearly seen as discrimination, then you will be negatively evaluated, for instance. Therefore, they are quite effective in upholding men's higher status, which is what Jackman predicted. So now we have tons of empirical evidence supporting this argument. So the talk, so that's kind of the theoretical background. The talk has two parts. The first part will focus on the nonverbal level. So we will look at these subtle forms of sexism effects at nonverbal level. So we are going to look at effects of smiling in nonverbal complementary behavior as a form of reinforcing gender power relations. That's a part of the talk called The Power of a Smile to Move You. And the second part of the talk, it's more applied and it focuses on consequences of confronting benevolent sexism, how to do it. So, okay, so if you want to know how to confront sexism in a manner that you won't pay the cost, you won't suffer the backlash, I'll try to give some answers for that. Right, so let's go start with the first one. So the first research question that I would like to address is, does nonverbal behavior of women themselves complement male dominance, becoming more submissive when it is presented in a friendly way, that is disguised with a smile? So dominance can be expressed with posture. It is generally expressed with posture. And women can complement that, becoming more submissive also in terms of their posture. So we can measure that. That's what we're going to try to do. And we want to see if that happens, especially when the dominance of the man is coupled with a smile. So the smile is giving the positive affiliative tone, like in benevolent sexism, the benevolent part is giving the positive tone to it. And why is it interesting to study nonverbal behavior? Because it is less easy to monitor and control. Like Nicole said at the beginning, I'm interested in forms of measuring reactions to disadvantage in ways that are not so easily observable or not so explicit or obvious. And the reason why I'm interested is because they are not so easily controlled. So sometimes you can see things at the nonverbal level that you cannot see at the verbal one. And but it can contribute very much to the maintenance of gender relations. Okay, so where does the complementary hypothesis come from? The complementary hypothesis, complementarity hypothesis, comes from very old or classical studies and interpersonal circumplex theories showing that the intergroup behavior can be studied or understood in two dimensions, affiliation and control. Affiliation refers to whether people are agreeable or not, or quarrelsome, and it leads to assimilation. So if someone is nice to you, you tend to be nice to that person. It relates a bit to the concept of mimicry. Whereas control or dominance leads to contrasts. So if someone is dominant and you're interacting with that person, the complementarity hypothesis says that there will be a tendency to complement, so become more submissive in front of a dominant person. And the reason for all of that is because what the hypothesis proposes that it's useful to keep cooperative interactions. And it's useful to achieve common goals. And it has been shown, or it's present even in non-human animal behavior. So complementarity is driven by an interpersonal motivation to develop or maintain cooperative interpersonal relations. And this hypothesis was tested at the nonverbal level by Lara Tiedens and Fragal in 2003. So they have a paper in which they show how there is a postural complementarity between two people when they are cooperating in a task. It's important to say that in their work they don't manipulate affiliation. It's just a cooperative setting. So it's assumed that it's an affiliative context. And it's done in power-balanced interactions. So power is held constant. Both of the people in the interaction have the same status and the same power. What is our rationale? So what we say is that complementarity is more likely to occur under intergroup conditions that provide grounds for power-based behavior to appear. So complementarity relates to dominance, and dominance relates to status and power, and status and power are group level phenomenon. So we need to look into that, because in real life we are constrained by the categories that are defining us as social individuals. So what is the case of gender? How do we define gender in terms of status and power? I guess there's no surprise. Here we know that men have more status than women, and this is a result of their social group membership. They are more likely, men are more likely to hold powerful positions in hierarchies. They more often endorse dominant ideologies and personalities, so there is also evidence showing that. And in terms of stereotypes, they are perceived as more dominant, whereas women are perceived as more submissive. So, yeah, and this dominance can be expressed clearly in male typical behavior. It's much more common to see that type of expansive behavior, which is related to dominance in men than in women. Okay, so the overview of the studies that I will present now is here. In the first study, in all of them, we manipulate the affiliation motivation by means of smiling. So we always have a condition in which we have a man confederate smiling most of the time, and a condition in which he is not smiling. And we cross that with, in the first study, with gender salience. So the first study tests the hypothesis of if we make the intergroup context salient, is the complementarity going to occur most probably in the high gender salient condition. In the second study, we make sure that what we are measuring or what we are showing is real complementarity by manipulating the posture itself. So we have a submissive and a dominant confederate. And in the last study, we also manipulate not only the physical dominance based on posture, but also the explicit sexism. So there is explicit sexist remark made. And the scenario is always the same. So all the studies are made with the same story. There is a male confederate that has high status. It's an instructor. So he has a high power position over female participants who are students. And he will express his personality dominance both verbally, making an explicit sexist remark in some of the studies and not in other conditions, and non-verbally holding a dominant posture. So that's the story. The general hypothesis is that when the context is cooperative, affiliative, and there is a smile, the motivation will be to complement a dominant behavior, therefore become more submissive, especially when gender is salient, because gender gives a background for power relations to activate. When the context is more competitive, that is, when there is no smile, then the motivation will be to contest the dominant behavior. If there is a gender salient context and the person is not being affiliative, there is no reason for you to become more submissive. You might want to resist that as much as you can. Right, so first study, manipulate smile. We manipulate context or gender salience, low gender salience, high gender salience. How is this manipulated? In the low gender salience condition, there is no mention about gender at all, whereas in the high one, gender is made salient, and there is a sexist remark in there. I'll show you in a minute. Why do I call the low gender salience condition low gender salience? It's just low because even if there is no mention about gender, there is an interaction between a man and a woman, so there is a little bit of gender salience. It's not like zero. Okay, so in the low gender salience condition, our confederate was an actor from the drama school in Cardiff. Introduced himself, hello, my name is Jane, blah, 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 we are conducting a study. And he would say at some point, we would also like to know whether people with different personalities have differences in communication style. I have been assigned to teach you. And towards the end of the instructions, he says, we are not interested in anyone individually, we are interested in the range of different styles across individuals. So there is no mention at all to gender here. In the high gender salience condition, in the same place, we have replaced some sentences. And so instead of saying, I'm interested in you, he says, we would also like to know whether men and women have differences in communication style. I have been assigned to teach the women. And then at some point he says, let's see if women can learn a little something from men. And we are interested in different styles of men and women. So it couldn't be more salient. This is the procedure. I need to walk you through the procedure, but I won't get in all the details because it's very complex, but I'm happy to give you more information afterwards if someone is interested. So upon arrival to the lab, the participant sits in a chair, and after signing all the consent form and so on, there is a first moment in which we record the posture to have a baseline. Then the researcher was giving some instructions, and afterwards there is the videotaped interaction with the instructor, and that lasts about a minute, if I'm not mistaken. Towards the end, there is the sexist remark. Then there is a small break with more instructions, and then there is the time in which the instructor is telling the story and the participant only listens. And this is when we measure if the posture has changed in relation to time one, okay? Along all the time, the confederate, depending on the condition, he's smiling more or he's not. And he's smiling or not in specific moments in the story. And then there is a part of retelling. So we have a lot of qualitative data that we haven't really analyzed, but when the participant actually tells the story. But that's something, too much work to do. Okay, dependent variables. We measure participants' automatic behavior, the nonverbal behavior, we measure it and we create an index of posture. We measure it 4 times during the time the confederate is giving the instructions, and then 3 times after that. And the confederate is doing the smiling or frowning, and then he also was doing a face rubbing because we just wanted to have like a neutral baseline to see if there was some basic mimicry going on. So we also measured, coded the participants in face rubbing, smiling, and frowning, and a set of questionnaires to measure how dominant, affiliative, sexist, how comfortable they were, etc. Predictions for posture, so I will focus on our main DV, which is the posture. The predictions for posture is that in the high gender salience condition, when he is smiling, then women will become more submissive. So the smile will make women complement him. Whereas when he's not smiling, maybe there is a little bit of room for resistance or competition and not wanting to complement him. There are no clear predictions for the low gender salience condition because, as I said at the beginning, it's not really like a no gender salience. There is a little bit of gender, so it's not comparable to the classical study of Tiedens and Fragal, but we could expect maybe perhaps some assimilation if the instructors is seen as an outgroup, so they might not like him and they might show some kind of resistance to him. What do we get? First, in terms of perception of the confederate, how is he perceived? He's more liked. He's perceived as less dominant and less sexist and less patronizing when he smiles than when he doesn't. There is an assimilation on the affiliation dimension, or so when he smiles, people smile more. When he's not smiling, people smile less over time. And the frowning goes in the opposite direction, so that makes sense. That's a simple assimilation effect. And how about the posture? So in the posture, there is the interaction that we were looking for between smiling, context, and time, so time 1 versus time 2. We control always for the baseline posture as well as a covariate. And here I'm presenting the index because you see more clearly if it goes down, it means they become more submissive. If it goes up across time, if it goes up, it means they become more dominant. These are all female participants. You cannot really expect female participants to become more dominant on the posture. It's quite difficult. It would imply doing something that we are not supposed to do. So what we see is more or less level of submissiveness. So what is significant here, apart from the general interaction, is that in the high gender salience condition, when the confederate is smiling, they become more submissive. When he's not, they don't do anything, which could be seen as a form of resistance because they don't complement. At least they stay the way they are. Okay, so participants complement a sexist and smiling confederate. They become more submissive, but not an unfriendly, not smiley one. Is the behavioral change in participants due to postural complementarity? To check that, we manipulate dominance in posture. So this is what we did in the second study. Here we compare smiling, non-smiling for a dominant and a submissive confederate. We expect complementarity to happen for the dominant one, but not for the submissive one, because that would contradict the gender relations. We don't expect that if the man is submissive, the woman will become more dominant. In this case, there were not the mimicry or the assimilation effects for smiling and frowning. There is only a main effect of dominance on smiling, so women smile more to a dominant confederate compared to a submissive one. This is consistent with the idea that women smile more as a sign of subordination that was already proposed in the literature. And how about posture? So again, we find the interaction we were looking for. And in this case, again, in the dominant smiling condition, participants become more submissive. What is leading the complementarity effect in the dominant intergroup setting? There is still a possible potential confound here. If you remember the instructions, it's gender salient, and there is also the sexist remark. So in the last study, what we did was to clear that issue by manipulating. We edited the video, and we literally cut off the tiny bit in which he was making the comment. So it's literally the same video as in study one, but with this tiny bit edited. The assumption is that the sexism reinforces the salience of the intergroup power differential. So that's a strong test for our hypothesis. But if gender is salient, it should happen that women complement the man in any way and they become more submissive. So we don't expect an interaction. We expect that there is an effect independently of whether the sexist remark is present or not. You remember this, so I don't need to show you again. Okay, so that's what we get. So there is no interaction. I mean, I show the graph, so at the level of means, it seems like the effect is bigger here than there, but there is no interaction. So there is effect of smile independent of sexism, which means they tend to become more submissive regardless of whether the sexism is present or not. What is nice about this study is, if you notice, for the first time we find a little bit of more clear tendency to resist. So a little bit of actual becoming more dominant in the girls or in the women. You might ask, I mean, there are lots of details I'm not saying, but one of the things is because we realized that for women it was difficult to change posture, so we also tried at the beginning when the experimenter was giving the instructions, and the experimenter was a woman, so we were trying to increase the tendency to use a little bit of more dominant posture to increase the probability to have effects in that direction. And also, in this last study, we wanted to check the hypothesis that is the basis of complementarity. is there an affiliative motive? Is there an affiliative motivation driving the effect? So we measured perceived warmth of the confederate, and we find that the smile predicts how warm he's perceived to be, and that predicts a change in posture. Okay. So across 3 studies, we provide evidence of a relative complementarity effect in nonverbal behavior when the intergroup dimension is salient and when an affiliation motive is present, the smile. So sexism with a smile doesn't undermine complementarity, submissiveness. So sexism goes easily that way, unnoticed. That's bad. That's like sad. But depending on how you interpret the data, you could also have a more positive or optimistic message out of it, because in an intergroup salient context, women do resist to some extent, at least when there is no affiliation motive present. So it's not that we have complementarity by definition in all the settings, but the smile helps to keep it, okay? So this is the reference for the paper where you can read the details about this, and now we'll move into the second research question. In this case, I'm not checking the time, so in this case, what we want to do is, okay, so this is sexism. You've seen it in the first part of the talk. Women face it daily. You know it. There are lots of women here. As victims, as bystanders. And in this case, you have 3 options what to do. You can confront, you can ignore it, or you can agree with it. If you want to confront, how can you do it, and what are the consequences for doing it? I must say also men can suffer sexism in the sense if they disagree with sexism, they might suffer in viewing sexism, but it's not the same as being the victim of it. So it's not that I'm saying that men like sexism per se. There are lots of differences there. So we will focus in this part of the talk on ambivalent sexism theory, which is something I introduced at the beginning. Just to make it more clear, ambivalent sexism proposes that there is a hostile type of sexism that sees women as dangerous and less capable, whereas there is a benevolent form of sexism that sees women as wonderful, need to be taken care of because they are weaker, but they are wonderful. Because benevolent sexism has this positive tone, its nature is difficult to recognize, and therefore it's difficult to confront it or to resist. So we especially want to know what happens when we confront benevolent sexism. So the literature on sexism confrontation has shown that confronting sexism has consequences for the confronter. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword because it increases competence of the confronter, self-esteem, and empowerment, but it also has social costs, as we will see in a second, and it also has positive consequences for bystanders or observers, and even for perpetrators, because it reduces future stereotype use and behavior in both of them. But it's infrequent, and the reason why it's infrequent, it's very infrequent to find sexism confrontation, is that it has very high social costs. And for instance, here there is one very nice study by Julia Becker in 2011 in which we see that confronting benevolent sexism has costs in terms of warmth, so you will be perceived as less warm if you confront sexism, but it has also some potential benefits because it will make the person see as more competent. So there are costs, but also benefits. Regarding forms of confrontation, in the literature, different forms of confrontation have been proposed, individual versus collective confrontation. Both types of confrontation are predicted by identification with women. So it's not that the individual confrontation is not predicted, it's also part of it, but only the collective confrontation is related to social change or to engagement in collective actions. Also, they've compared aggressive versus non-aggressive forms of confrontation, finding that the non-aggressive forms of confrontations are preferred by both men and women. No surprise here, but this is predicted by gender identification. I also want to propose two more distinctions in the type of confrontation or in forms of confrontations that were not addressed so far in the literature, to my knowledge. I think we could differentiate between more direct or blatant forms of confrontation and more indirect or subtle forms of confrontation. And also, I think it might be interesting to consider the role that the emotions we display with our face when we confront in the consequences that the message has. Right. Okay. So here is an overview of the next set of studies that I will present. There are 3 studies. All of them are done in the context of dating or relationship between young people. 2 of the studies are conducted at high schools and 1 with university sample. So in all of them, we manipulate the sexist message, whether it's hostile or benevolent, because we really want to see especially the consequences of the confrontation of benevolent. And then in the first study, we focus on manipulating the confrontation style, direct versus indirect, or more subtle, and control condition. In the second study, we manipulate smiling versus angry faces when doing so. In the third study, we manipulate whether it's individual or collective versus control. So in the first study, we have direct, indirect, and control. In the second and in the third, we only use direct. Okay? We just focus on the direct forms of confrontation. The general assumptions or predictions are that there will be interpersonal costs of confronting sexism directly, especially if you confront BS, not only at the workplace, which is something that has been shown in the literature, but also in interpersonal romantic relationships. But there are ways of overcoming them if we use the affiliation motivation. So now we will use the complementarity hypothesis argument to reply. And there are benefits of confrontation because it increases awareness of sexism if it's done at a collective level. In the first study, all the studies are also, in terms of methodology, the same. There is a scenario that participants read, and it's a dating context between a young man and a woman, and they are discussing about the possibility of going out at night. Of course, everything was pre-tested and piloted. I don't like that you go out on your own. People will think you want to flirt. That's a hostile comment by the man. And in the benevolent one, I don't like you go out on your own. I prefer to accompany and take care of you. That would be a benevolent type of message. The way of confronting it in the direct condition, it's collective and direct. You're being sexist. We girls can go out on our own as boys do. In the indirect condition, come on, it's not a big deal. You will see that nothing happens. I want to go out. In the no confrontation, there is simply no response by the girl. And then we measure a set of DVs related to attraction, attitudes, and warmth, perceived warmth, competence, and perceived sexism. Right, so this sample is a school sample, and the mean age is 14 years old. So here we clearly see the costs of confronting benevolent sexism as expected. This is the perceived warmth that men see in women. Sorry for the labels in Spanish, by the way. So basically, when benevolent sexism is confronted directly, then they are perceived as less warm, okay? And this mediates the perceived attractiveness of the girl and the liking of her. So basically, it has consequences also for the interpersonal relation. How do women deal then with these interpersonal costs? Yeah, there are interpersonal costs. How can we deal with them, or how do we deal with them? Direct collective confrontation is a sign of dominance. If you want to confront a man directly, collectively, you are showing dominance, and that's something you shouldn't do because you're a woman. So smiling is a sign of subordination, and it's particularly shown by women in low power positions, and it's also the other side of the coin in the complementarity hypothesis. So this brings back what we saw in the previous presentation. So can complementarity in this case help them to overcome the interpersonal backlash? I mean, can the smile for women have an instrumental function to get the confrontation message through? So this is what we try to find out in the second study. In this case, the comment is always, you're being sexist, we girls can go out on our own as boys do. So there is always a clear confrontation, direct and at the collective level. But the girl is sometimes smiling and sometimes happy, sometimes angry. In this case, the sample is all men, and these are university students. And what we see is that, yeah, if you don't want to lose warmth, if you care about the relationship with that person, we are talking about romantic relationships. Generally, you care about the relationship. You don't want it to get spoiled. And you still want to say, this is sexism. Do it with a smile. Then you won't lose warmth, for sure. You will win in warmth. But this is, okay, but does it have also an impact on how sexist the man is perceived to be? And this is what I really like of this data, is that, yeah, so if you confront smiling a benevolent man, then he will be seen as machista, so macho, so sexist, as much as a hostile one. So in control condition, a benevolent man is always perceived as less macho than a hostile one. If you confront him smiling, he'll be seen as sexist, as a hostile one, and more sexist than in control condition, and also more sexist than in an angry condition. So I think it also helps in the sense of getting the message through. It's not only that it avoids costs, but it also gets the message through. How about anger? Because we also have the right to be angry and express it when we confront sexism. So what happens if we do that? So first of all, it doesn't really change attitudes toward women. So there are no worse attitudes towards women confronting benevolent sexism. So there are no effects on the benevolent sexism. The attitudes get a bit worse when a woman confronts a hostile comment being angry. But I don't think that's much of a big deal. It's kind of just simply because it creates a more aggressive context in general. Hostility is higher in general. But there are no costs in terms of confronting benevolent sexism in an angry manner. And also, it increases perceived competence. So direct confrontation has social costs, but not if the confronter complements with positive affiliation using the smile. This has two possible interpretations. On the one hand, we might perpetuate the understated differences because smile is a sign of subordination, so some people might say that way of confronting is sexist in itself. But it also helps to unmask benevolent sexism because it increases perceived sexism in men when done with a smile. So other men see the sexist man as more sexist when he's confronted with a smile. So in terms of instrumental function, it might be useful. The last question I'd like to address is, again, we have a bit of a potential confound in the direct manipulation because it's direct but it's collective. So is it important that it's done at the collective level? Does the confrontation being direct but not collective has the same effect? So in the last study, again, we have a high school sample, And we manipulate the message, the confrontation, whether it's collective, you're being sexist, we girls can go out on our own as boys do. This is the same as in study 1 and 2. And we create a new condition, direct, but at the individual level. I disagree, I can go out on my own as you do, okay? So the first result we get here, interesting result, is that boys prefer girls who confront, both at the collective level or at the individual level, in terms of liking and attractiveness, but also on perceived competence. So women that confront are seen as more competent by men, by women too, but I wouldn't be surprised by that so much. In the attractiveness part is moderated by men hostile sexism. So the effect works for those that are low on hostile sexism. So the ones that are low on hostile sexism see a woman that is a confronter as more likable. And what are the benefits of confronting at the collective level? The main benefit is that, or one interesting benefit is that for women attitudes, women that are high on hostile sexism, when they see that a man is confronted collectively, they like him less. So even those women that endorse sexism themselves, they realize, or to some extent, they start disliking that guy. So we managed to get to a difficult audience. These are the women that are high on hostile sexism. And that effect mediates also the perceived sexism. So basically, women that confront sexism are seen as less, men that express sexism are seen as less likable, and that makes them be seen also as more sexist, okay? In the collective compared to the other two conditions. So to give a general comment to end, to avoid confrontation of benevolent sexism, interpersonal costs, and increase awareness amongst women and men, confront directly and collectively with a big smile. But don't worry, if you are angry, that works too. You will increase competence and that breaks the stereotype. So actually, both ways it works. Depends on whether you are interested in keeping the positive relation with the other person. You might consider using the affiliative motivation, but if you don't really care about the relation, you can be angry, then break the relationship. That's also an option. Thank you to my collaborators, Russell Spears, Miguel Moya, and Rosa Moncayo, and thank you to you for listening.
We have time for a few questions.
You mentioned before that among women who, I believe you said, were okay with sexism, how they responded negatively to hostile sexism still. What do you suppose are the factors for that?
Say that again, because I think if I understood it correctly, you said it the other way, so I'm not sure you... So
before you had the chat saying that even women who were all right...
High in hostile sexism?
That they did not agree with...
So when they are exposed to a direct confrontation, direct collective confrontation of sexism, they stop liking. So they liked him more when there was no direct confrontation.
Yes.
See what I mean? So the direct confrontation make them think that he's less likable.
So is that just a matter of charisma, or is that such as they just don't like his personality, even if they are...
But that depends on the confrontation message, which is not given by the man, it's given by a woman. So the effect is driven by whether another woman is confronting him or not. So it might be that because he's being confronted, he starts being seen as less charismatic. That's possible. Yeah, I didn't measure that. Yeah, it is possible. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure what charismatic means. I would have to try to.
Do you measure hostile sexism before they watch the confrontation? So as an individual difference measure?
No. You mean it's at the very end.
Oh,
it's at the very
okay.
end,
So
but it's not affected by the manipulations.
That maybe particularly for these women, it changes, like it confronts them, it changes the perceived social norm.
Yeah.
And it might change the hostile sexism, but it doesn't work if you actually measured it afterwards.
It's not affected, but you cannot argue that way. I think there was a question at the very end. Yeah.
So in your second set of studies, if I've got this correct, when you're personally confronted a sexist individual, and that individual is then viewed more negatively, but they did it with a smile, you seem to be suggesting there's some discord with the idea that smiles are submissive. But are smiles also always submissive? Because I imagine in that scenario, if someone's made a comment to you, then you're able to rise above it and smile and maintain a positive frame of mind, then that's actually a dominant thing to do. So you always refer to smiles as submissive.
But I agree with your point. That's actually what I try to argue, but the literature would tell you the opposite. So the literature generally would say that smile shows subordination. And what I try to say is that maybe sometimes smile is a form of resistance and it can help you to challenge. So I think that smile might have a different meaning, as you said, but I'm not so sure about the meaning, which is what you're suggesting, which is a very interesting question, but for sure it has a different function. It becomes instrumentally useful. So it doesn't necessarily need to be helping to perpetuate the system. Yeah, thanks.
Have there been any studies comparing smiling among the same gender, so between men, for example? Because going from what the other person said, sometimes I feel like smiles can be used as a way of communicating between men as well.
As a way of?
Confrontation. You're showing that person's behavior doesn't bother you. And, in that way you're trying to make them uncomfortable with the situation because you're saying, I'm not uncomfortable with it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting question. The thing is that wouldn't be literature on confronting sexism or anything like that. That would be more on, I think there is very interesting research on humor and what the impact humor has on social perception. And in that type of literature, maybe there is something along the lines that you're suggesting. Yeah. So if you want to check into that, I would go for literature on humor. There are some very interesting theories there.
In your studies, it's women confronting sexism. Have you considered reactions to men confronting sexism?
Yeah.
So, speaking of him as a man, is that then seen as a form of benevolent sexism?
Yeah. Well, that's actually some studies we are doing now. But that's too new, too preliminary to present. What I can tell you is we are looking at the underlying motivations for men when the men confront, and basically there are two possible underlying motivations. One is being feminists themselves, so endorsing a feminist ideology and wanting actually to, even like in terms of human rights, just disagreeing with the fact. But there is also a paternalistic motivation that can lead to confrontation. So there are two paths to confrontation. One is the feminist or egalitarianism, and the other one is paternalism. Yes, we have evidence for both of them. And the question now is to disentangle when one is used or the other one. So the big question is, are men allies or not against sexism? And in order to answer that question, we need to know what they mean when they are trying to help us, because if you help us with a paternalistic motivation, then actually that doesn't help. So it's a little bit of a complicated issue, but yeah, we are working on that, and I'm very excited about that project.
You mentioned about men being affected by being like bystanders. to sexism and stuff.
Yeah.
Is there any literature on the effect on men of like being the victims of sexism? Obviously, like in a different way to women, but in terms of like negative stereotypes or specific, like having to live up to specific stereotypes. Is that an area that there's been studies on, or is it largely?
You mean, I mean, that's not sexism?
Okay.
Yeah, but there are studies, for instance, on the threats to masculinity by femininity in men. So when men show femininity, that feminine behavior, for instance, that might have consequences, and yeah, they might be perceived less competent and so on and so forth. Yeah, there is literature on that, but that's not reactions to sexism in men. It's more like prejudice related to feminine behaviors in men, for instance. There is lots of literature by Juanma Falomir Pichastor. He's a professor in the University of Geneva, and he has very nice papers in that type of line. Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, so thank you very much for a very nice
Thank
talk.
you.
And there'll be wine and juice next door.